All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the technical roundtable number 1 with Travis Buckley from Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. You'll be discussing the current manure storage abandonment procedures, and as well as going through recommendations from counties with experience. And I'll also be leading a discussion on the current manure composting methods. We'll also hear from Drew Zellies, who will be assisting Travis and monitoring the chat and engaging along with the discussion. For those of you who haven't recognized me, I'm Michael Hook. I'm new to the team at Wisconsin Land & Water, helping lead SITCOM, the State Interagency Training Committee, and working on developing some of our training efforts. So I'm going to toss over to Drew, who is one of my first awesome agency contacts. And if you need any help, you can message me or any other Wisconsin Land & Water staff in the chat.
All right, with that, thanks, Michael. With that, welcome to Technical Roundtable 1, and I sure wish I could be face-to-face as I've done, in the past years, but once again, we're doing it virtually. So with this technical roundtable and how I like to run it is I really encourage your questions. I encourage you taking us down rabbit holes that we don't want to go to. That discussion, when I look at the people in the audience out there, you all know how to do this. You all know how to do a manure storage abandonment. I've done them with you shoulder to shoulder several different times. You have the experiences here. So I really encourage you to share your experiences, especially from county to county. That's the strength of your organization. And really that's the strength of these technical roundtable. We'll present on manure storage abandonment, and we'll talk about composting, but the stuff that you do within your own counties, that's what's really important. So please don't hesitate to share. You can put your stuff in the chat box, or you can talk to that always works for me too. So with that being said, we'll get going. We're going to start with manure storage abandonment, and with that, I'll pass it over to Travis Buckley, my partner in conservation and crime. Depends upon the day. Travis Buckley, for DATCP engineer from Appleton. Here you go, Travis.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Like Drew said, my name is Travis Buckley. I'm the DATCP area engineer in Northeast Wisconsin. Have been in that role for 7 years now. Hard to believe. Prior to that, I was a land conservation technician up in Oconto County. So it's always an honor to be a part of Wisconsin Land & Water. I've attended a lot of these. I can actually say I attended an actual WULS conference as well. So been around long enough for that. But yeah, good to be here. And I thank everybody for taking the time. So like Drew said, we're going to do kind of the technical roundtable. This is going to be a two-part presentation. So the first part, we're going to talk about waste facility closure, specifically the 360 standard. And then we're going to transition to talking about manure composting. So we'll have some time kind of at the end of each section here to answer questions, or if like Drew said, if there's anything you want to input, or if there's anything I missed, totally feel free. And we can talk. Yeah, and it sounds like the chat is where we're going to do that. So with that, let's get into it. All right. So the first topic we're going to talk about is waste facility closure. So what is a waste facility closure? This is right out of the standard. Basically, it's decommissioning a facility where agricultural waste has been treated or stored and it's no longer used. Pretty basic. We're talking about everything from liquid storages or traditional like lagoon type things, to solid storages, above ground stuff like slurry stores, as well as reception tanks, storages that are underneath barns. The standard also gets into, barnyards, feedlot type stuff. So again, really anything that stored waste or was used to, anything really involving manure. So. All right, well, I always like to, whenever I'm doing a presentation or talking about a topic, I like the why do we care question. Why is this a part of technical roundtable? Well, the purpose of the 360 standard, or waste facility closure in general, is, again, pretty common sense. You know, we're after the protection of surface water and groundwater. We're also trying to eliminate potential hazards. You know, some of the reception tanks, if they're left unclosed, you know, could pose a safety hazard, as well as, you know, lagoons and things like that. So getting those off the landscape for safety reasons is always good. Air emissions, you know, that's, you know, we're talking about, you know, potentially odors or, you know, stuff like that. And then, you know, public health, which would relate to both the physical safety hazards as well as the surface groundwater protection. Now, I just wanted to note that, you know, closure is actually called out as part of NR 151's manure storage facility performance standard. So, I mean, it's statute that closures are something that we need to be concerned about. I think the statute actually says closure should take place within 2 years of, you know, being inactive. So we all know how often that happens, but just to note that it is waste closure is part of NR 151 rule. So. All right, so now let's get into the 360 design criteria. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts of the 360 standard and the closure process. All right, so the first thing we need to do is waste removal, right? So step one is we got to get the manure out of this thing, whatever it is, a storage, a tank, whatever. So basically the waste is really in two forms. We have our liquid and slurry waste, which typically we can agitate and pump out. And then we have our sludge and solid waste, which, you know, for that we're talking physical removal, you know, scooping it out with a high hoe or something like that. And, you know, obviously that's easier said than done in a lot of cases, but if you are working on a waste facility closure project, you know, make sure the contractor knows their equipment's probably going to get pretty dirty. The other thing when we're doing the solid removal is we need to watch that liner, and we want to protect the integrity of the liner until we get the waste out of there, right? And that makes sense. We don't want to cause an environmental problem trying to do something good. So keeping it, so protecting that liner while we're getting, you know, all the waste out of the old storage is a good thing. And then whether it's the liquid or slurry waste or the sludge solid waste, you know, either one of those is going to need to get, you know, utilized according to the nutrient management plan, their 590 plan. So, you know, usually we're field applying that material according to their 590. All right, so once we got all the manure out of our storages or out of our storage, now we got to worry about the liner. So the liner is, you know, this is, you know, think of a manure pit lagoon. This is the concrete, this is the clay, you know, whatever that liner was. One type is flexible membrane. You know, these are our, you know, kind of the plastic, think the black plastic, you know, the HDMI type stuff. This stuff is basically you're going to need to remove it and dispose of it. One thing to keep in mind with those types of liners is you're not going to be able to bury them on site. You know, that's not allowed in Wisconsin. So it's going to have to get landfilled. And, you know, there's going to be a certain level of work on that too, because it's not, I've run into cases or heard of cases where not just any landfill will take that stuff either. So those aren't real common, but just keep that in mind that there could be some substantial cost with closing a pit like that with landfill and not being able to bury it. So concrete's a pretty common liner type. Basically, your options with that are to remove it and dispose of it. You know, concrete, once it's clean, can go to, you know, some quarries will take it. You know, landfill might be an option. Obviously, there's cost associated with that, tipping fee type stuff. The other option is, you know, you can clean it and render it unable to store anymore. So basically, we're talking punch some holes in it or bust some holes in it, or whatever it is to make it so it can't hold liquid, and then it could stay in place, provided there isn't contamination, which we'll talk about in a second here. But that is an option. Once it can't hold liquid, it can stay in place and it's clean. The other one is to bury it. You know, usually that involves ripping it up and then, you know, either burying it within the waste storage or digging a separate hole and burying it. The key thing there is you need at least 3 feet of cover to be able to do that. So, I mean, honestly, that's probably the most common thing we see, just because it's the cheapest, is to bury that concrete on site in some fashion. So, you know, we'll talk about a little bit later. We'll talk about some other stuff that I've run into, but typically that's what we're doing, is we're cleaning it and then we're burying it on site. The other common liner type is clay. You know, this your options are, you know, depending on your site, you can, again, rip the clay out, you know, pull that clay out to get down to native soil. And, you know, once you down to clean clay, you know, bury that or utilize that in some other way, whatever. Or again, we're talking about rendering it unable to hold liquid, so puncturing and then just leaving that clay material there. So options depending on your site and project. All right, so now we got the waste out, we've got our liner out. So now we need to be worried about our contaminated soil underneath our liner. So this is a result of, you know, just over time leaking, leaching, you know, any, you know, cracks in the concrete, just seeping into the clay, whatever. It's basically soil mixed with waste once we get our liner out. And basically the standard says we need to remove that material to the extent necessary to get it all, or a minimum of 6 inches. So what are we looking for? You know, this is going to require, you know, a lot of times this is where the technician really comes into play, because they're going to be responsible for doing that investigation to look for the contamination. And what are you looking for? Well, the obvious one is odor. You know, if it still stinks, it's probably going to need to still come out. Color, you know, like the picture there, if you're seeing, you know, dark in relation to the native soil or things like that, you know, that's a good indication that you still got some material to get out of there. Consistency of the soil. So if you're seeing, you know, wet or, you know, a higher moisture than, you know, the native soil around it, or you know, noticeable, you know, pockets of wetness or something, you know, that's a good indication that, you know, maybe something got through that need to get out of there. I think not on this list. I think Drew did a training one time about a little taste test, but no, I'm kidding, Drew. I just obviously don't put anything in your mouth on a waste storage facility closure project, or any project for that matter. So odor, color, consistency, those are going to be your good indicators that you got soil to get out of there. All right, so again, we got our manure out. Now we got our liner out. We got all our contaminated soil out. So what do we got left? Well, now we have our actual 313 or our actual structure. So this is, you know, whether it's, we're going to talk about the different types here, but in this case, the first type is the impoundment. So these are our lagoon type 313s. So the options for taking care of those again, the liner's gone and all that. So basically now we need to think not able to pond water is kind of our first options. So breaching, if we have embankments around a manure storage, or that's embankments that make up a manure storage, we can breach those. So basically it's bust a hole in it. And, you know, not real common because aesthetically, you know, most farms would rather, you know, get rid of it than to just have it with a big hole in the side of it. The other option is to backfill it. So essentially fill it in. That's probably the most common option, because a lot of times, you know, where those storages are, want to get the landowner wants to use it for something else. So whether they want to convert it back into crop field or, you know, use it for building space or whatever, usually that space has value. So backfilling it is the most common one that I see. The other option is, you know, identified in the standard, is you can convert the thing to a freshwater pond or some freshwater type use. You know, again, you know, the waste is gone, the liner's gone, and, you know, any contaminated material is gone. So it should be, you know, safe to do that. But obviously, again, I wouldn't say that's a real common thing, but it is allowed by the standard. So, all right, so the other type, fabricated structures. So this think above ground or think vertical walls. So slurry stores, you know, vertical walled concrete pits, stuff like that is what this is getting at. So obviously step one on these is again, you know, follow all those previous processes where we got to clean them out, and now we got to demolish it. So this is busting up concrete walls or taking the slurry store panels apart, or even just, again, altering it so it can't hold liquid was an option as well. You don't need to completely demolish it necessarily. It just needs to not be able to store. So obviously keep the demolished material in mind, you know, where that's going to go temporarily. The key word there is temporarily. You know, we need to, it's this ripping apart a vertical walled storage and putting it in a pile for long term probably isn't the best idea. You obviously need to think about safety, human and animal safety as well. You know, if you got a big pile of concrete with rebar sticking out of it, you know, maybe some temporary fencing or something around that might be a good idea. Things like that. So that's kind of what we mean by storing it in a safe manner is making sure that somebody's not going to get hurt on it. And then obviously once it's all demolished or disassembled, you know, we need to get it disposed of properly. Or if it's material that can get buried, like clean concrete, we can do that as well. All right, under building structures, there's kind of their own special thing here. These are a common one is reception tanks when we talk about underbarned structures. There's also, you know, full-blown underbarned storages as well out there that we need to close. But for these, it's a little different because we don't have the access that we do on some of those storage types. So step one is again, we got to get the waste out. So we got to get the manure out. Now, you know, this is again easier said than done for some of these, but you know, probably looking at maybe adding water to try to agitate or something to get at those. But yeah, step one is we got to get as much of the waste out as possible. And then we're basically filling it in. So we're not as concerned with, all right, we got to take this structure apart or down or whatever. Get the waste out and then fill it with sand or clean mineral soil, and then surface it with something. So whether that's, once it's filled up with sand or soil, putting concrete over the top, or gravel or whatever, some type of surface material though needs to go over top of that. Usually that depends on what that building is going to be used for post closure. If they're going to keep using the building for storage or something, maybe they want to do concrete or whatever. But the big thing there, is to try to, we don't want a bunch of water getting back into it, even though it's filled in with sand. We got a little bit of time here. So quick story on one of these, we had an underbarned storage where the guy wanted to convert a reception tank to a root store, or like a root cellar, which posed a lot of interesting questions on cleaning and safety and things like that. So once in a while you run into some crazy stuff with these things, but the majority of them, we're gonna clean them out, fill them with sand, and then service them with something else. All right, so just some other considerations that are in the standard and stuff that I ran into in my career. Obviously, transfer system components, don't forget about those. Pipes, pumps, all that kind of stuff. We want to get those either removed or, ideally removed, but at a minimum, so they're not gonna, cause any issues. So obviously getting, pipes either crushed or removed so they're not, leaking anything, or, but yeah, don't forget about transfer components. Some of these older pits, sometimes the transfer stuff can be kind of a surprise. So keep that in mind. If it is a really old storage that, maybe the current landowner hasn't wasn't involved with or anything, and they don't know where the transfer pipes go or come from or anything like that. So just be aware of that. Be conscious of the transfer system. I also wanted to mention, testing. That is an option as well. If you're looking at extent of contaminated soil, or you want to get a baseline for the site, or even afterwards down the road, keep that in mind that testing is an option as well for looking at contamination. It's not, I wouldn't say, I personally haven't run into it, but it can be done. It's out there. Erosion control and seeding, keep that in mind. What's the end site going to look like? If you are regrading manure storage and you're going to fill it in, is there a need for a temporary cover crop or erosion control or seeding? A lot of these are get converted back into production land, so maybe you don't need to worry about seeding if they're just going to get tilled and planted with crops. But again, keep that in mind. The other thing to watch out for is your fill material needs. So if you're doing a waste storage, like a lagoon type waste storage, and your plan is to push in the embankments and fill it in and grade it smooth kind of thing, be a little careful about, hey, what if I got to remove more contaminated soil than I originally thought or something? What are you gonna need to fill this thing in? Do you have the material, even if you have some contingency type situations come up? So, or where are you going to get extra material from if you do run into a situation where you got to remove more than you thought or things like that? So just keep that in mind, the fill material you're going to need to get this done. The other one is bedrock and subsurface saturation. So this actually, we ran into this on a recent project that I was helping with. We had high bedrock, so that obviously impacted our closure strategy because we couldn't bury the concrete and get 3 feet of cover because of the bedrock. So obviously that added some costs to the project because it had to get hauled off site. But again, something to the good thing is we were aware of the high bedrock prior to, or kind of during the planning process, so we were able to account for that and work with that. But if it would have been a surprise, it would have been a significant surprise, let's put it that way. So then obviously subsurface saturation, it's probably not a good idea if you are going to bury liner material or if you are worried about I don't know, keep it in mind, and because it may impact your project. Invasive species, this is one that I had come up on a project. The invasive species coordinator for the county got involved with the closure project because it was an older lagoon type pit. The whole inside of the embankments were all Phragmites, invasive Phragmites. So it brought up the discussion about where is that material going to go? Where we don't want to have this invasive species spread because of the closure project. So it was just an interesting, I don't think it's real common, but it came up on a project and it was something that I hadn't run into before, which was interesting. And then the other one that was kind of interesting that came up was additional material processing. So the landowner wanted to clean the concrete on his closure project, remove the concrete, and then he wanted to crush it and use it for aggregate. So they kind of just brought up some of the, what's cost shareable and what's not when we're talking about waste facility closure. And we decided that crushing the concrete was above and beyond what would be necessary as part of the waste facility closure. I mean, we were fine with the landowner doing that, but that would have been in addition to our project. And the other concern we had was when that was going to happen. Obviously we didn't want that concrete sitting waiting to be crushed for years and years. You know how that goes, where the guy just never gets the crusher there. So we wanted some type of assurance that that material was going to get, something was going to happen with it. But again, just something weird we ran into recently was wanting to crush the concrete.
Hey, Travis, we're starting to get questions in the chat box, and I think they're pretty
almost
pertinent what you're saying. So.
Yeah, we're almost done. So maybe just let me get through this. I think this is the last slide even.
Okay.
So, and then we'll dive into it. But I just wanted to quick touch on a 360 construction plan. Usually these plans are pretty simple. We got a cover sheet or quantities or construction notes. We're looking at usually a plan view and then some cross sections. The one shown there, you can see they got kind of what the pit looks like and kind of what the finished ground is going to look like and things like that. So pretty basic plan. As far as DATCP engineering certification and job approval, this 360 is kind of considered one of the more basic practices, I would say, in terms of job approval authority and certification. So a lot of times when you're just getting into into the job approval world, this is one of the first practices you're usually going to get some approval for. The controlling factors are broken into the liner type. So it's either earthen or concrete, and then it's storage volume. So 1,000 cubic feet. So how that works with the job class. So a job class 1, for instance, is everything up to 25,000 cubic feet because the units are 1,000. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, Drew, what do we got?
Yeah, we got a couple of them, and I'll help you out with these because there's some stuff I wanted to bring up too. Tina from Dunn County asks, do you ask for compaction of sand and soil with underbarn closures? And what about sites with sludge solid waste in the bottom of an underbarn concrete pit? How much do you worry about it getting it removed and keeping in mind the confined space regulations? How much do you investigate underbarn pits for cracks if it's prohibitive to enter confined space? And Travis, I'll start off on this one because I was going to bring it up. Tina, you ask an awesome question because these are super, super difficult to abandon. One of these things you have to realize with an underbarn system is a lot of time, if it's a Weezer panel built structure, you can't just pull all the panels away because it's not designed for that. It's designed to have those posts and beams to stay in place. So it's tricky. We did one in Wood County, Shane, if you're on, there was a section of it that was falling apart. We basically cleaned as much as we could by looking into it, pressure washed it, sucked out any of the water, but then we filled it in with sand and gravel by dropping it through the slats on top. So compaction, it was hard to get until we got to a point where we could pull the panels off and start compacting it. So there's no hard and fast rule from my experience on that. I think you just got to use best professional judgment because you certainly don't want to go into that confined space, man. It's just not worth it. But you look where you can and make your observations where you can. But there's a lot of people out there have had this similar question. Jan in Brown County and Shane in Wood are just fresh in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, obviously human safety is paramount. So, I mean, obviously it's not worth getting somebody killed. The good thing with those underbarn is you're really not compromising the liner per se, so if you don't get every last ounce of manure, theoretically, your environmental risk should still be pretty low because you're not, that storage is still going to stay intact. But yeah, those are definitely tough. I mean, it's just because of access.
Okay, so Jim from Clark County asked about storages that were put in a wetland, and believe it or not, this is more common than you would think. I've seen them with Dan O'Connell in Portage County. And you have to look to see where the manure pit is because it kind of blends in with a wetland. So I'll let you answer that. What do you do with a pit that's in a wetland? That's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess don't do any extra fill outside of the pit. Yeah, I mean, talk to DNR. I mean, I would think DNR is gonna want that out of there. So I would hope that they would be. I would hope they would be willing to work with you to get, to get the closure done and, get the site, leveled and graded up, but.
And the other thought process with that too, typically, if that's the case, it's going to be an old late 70s, early 80s structure. I know Dan and I, we were on site, we just talked it through and maybe the contaminants have already been assimilated up into the wetland plants. So maybe it looks like a site in a wetland, but environmentally, maybe it's not as bad as other sites. Those are just considerations when you, again, use your best professional judgment on some of these and decide exactly the route that you're going to take them to. One thing I will emphasize is reuse has really gotten to be popular, where you're actually taking that manure storage structure or storage pit and you're reusing it for something else. In the last couple of years, I've seen a lot more technicians go into a reuse where they reshape the side slopes and they use it for a swimming hole or for a wetland. And that's kind of a trend that I've seen.
Yeah.
Okay, we're still not done. Okay, and then Max from Lafayette County, he says he's asking any knowledge of where slurry store panels can be disposed of or a company that will take them. keep in mind when you abandon a slurry store, you still got that starter ring, which you're really not going to be able to get out. But if that's a good question, is somebody recycling slurry store panels? And you might not know, Travis, but does anybody else know? But please add to that, or unmute and talk.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a recycling component to those. You know, I mean, they're metal, so I mean, I don't know how that, you know, the coating on the outside would affect recycling or not. But
you know, we used to.
I haven't heard a lot of interest in, you know, reusing them. You know, where you got to be really careful taking them apart if you want to reuse them and things like that. But that, you know, the whole reuse thing on a slurry store is kind of, I don't know. I haven't heard much on that.
There used to be a company called Great Lakes Silo that used to redo them, and then they would certify the warranty. But I think that's changed. Yeah. You know, slurry stores are not slurry stores anymore. They're owned by CRT. I just don't know if that's a possibility. And then bring it back into NRCS 313 requirements. I don't know if that's a possibility anymore.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question, Travis? Max. You know, go ahead.
Yeah, Drew. Hey, this is Seth with Dane County.
Sure.
We've got a contractor that we've been working with down here. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but he has been scrapping them. Basically comes in with a excavator with a shear, you know, tooth on it, and cuts them to pieces, crumples them up, and hauls them off as scrap. That was the last one was a few years ago. But I can get the name and contact info out to you guys.
Yeah, that would be good.
So there's value in the metal, at least.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's why I'm saying a lot of you folks, you know, better than I do, the answers to some of these questions. So Seth, I really appreciate you chiming in. So Tina has a follow-up question. Has anyone successfully recycled a flexible liner? Are they being landfilled? To my knowledge, they're being landfilled. I haven't heard anybody recycle one. They've been landfilled. I don't get involved in a lot of them because I'm on the eastern part of the state. So anybody recycling HDPE aligners?
Everyone I've heard of has been landfilled. But...
Yeah. So.
Okay.
All right, and then Andrew Horn from Outland Design asks, does the NRCS 360 encompass a VTA abandonment, or how is that reviewed?
VTA, that's an interesting question too. Honestly, it might underneath the kind of that treatment aspect. You know, that might be one where you might have to look at doing some actual testing, you know, soil testing, and see, you know, are there elevated nutrients, or kind of what are you dealing with? You know, I think, you know, the spreader pad and things like that, you know, that would be pretty classic, you know, clean it, rip it up. But yeah, the actual physical VTA is an interesting question.
But you know, it does give you guidance. You know, for example, you can use, let's say you've got a manure filled ditch, you know, because things like that happen. I still will use that manure, the 360 standard, to help me abandon it. And what comes to mind, that mink operation you did in Sheboygan County with the mink manure all over those ditches. You abandoned that as if it were a manure storage bed, even though it was a ditch.
Yeah, I mean, it was, we were dealing with soil laden manure, you know, all over the site. There was more of a site remediation, and yeah, we used the 360 because that's the closest thing we had in an NRCS standard world that we live in. You know, that was the best we had.
So yeah, again, a lot of it, you gotta put your thinking cap on it and use best professional judgment, especially in these, because the standard is not necessarily going to fit the site that you have. Christina from La Crosse asked, how quote unquote clean does a pit have to be, particularly concrete pits, to begin the demolition process? Basically what I do, Christina, is I'm going to remove the manure. I'm going to go down there. I'm going to get down to that concrete liner. I'm going to start breaking up that concrete liner in selected spots. If I don't see contamination underneath that liner in some designated spots, you know, like in the sump or where the transfer pipe comes in there, if I don't see any type of contamination, I'm going to say that the liner's been penetrated. So it really, for me, it always comes down to visual. I know Travis brought up the fact that I taste test. I don't, for the record, I don't taste test manure, you know, but I do look at it. And when I look for those discolorations, that to me is probably the best indicator of clean. I certainly don't pressure wash the side slopes of a concrete line manure pit. I agitate and remove as much manure as possible. I investigate underneath that liner and then abandon it accordingly. Travis, are you doing anything different, or is anybody else doing anything different for that matter?
No, I think it's do the best you can and use your professional common sense. You know, there's no like black and white answer, I guess. It's going to depend on the project and the site, but use your judgment, use your common sense. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to get the concrete to look like your driveway or to be able to eat off of it by any means. So, you know, yeah.
Right. So Tina from Dunn County, I ask again, and I think this is really pertinent on this subject. What about manure gases with non-underbarned structures? We've had many incidents in our area where people have died due to succumbing of manure gases. I can vouch for that myself. I was on a pit in Jefferson County with Patricia Cicero, God, back in, you know, a long time ago, and we were down in the bottom of that manure pit, and it was a clay lined pit. And we both got sick, and we both kind of said, hey, you know what, we're not feeling right. And this was just a normal abandonment, open air. We just were not feeling it. And we had to climb our way out of that pit. So even though it's not an under or enclosed facility, you need to be consciously aware. You know, we had that issue in Portage County on the Beatish farm where we had the accident where the landowner was agitating. So manure gas safety has to be paramount depending upon where you're at and what you're doing. You got to think about it. You know, you got to be wise about it, because it still can come into play in these open air structures. It could be based off the configuration of the building, the wind direction, the humidity, a lot of different factors. Just you got to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's if you're dealing with manure, yeah, you gotta be, you know, stay aware, you know. And I mean, we at DATCP, we do have some manure gas sensors for us to wear. Do we use them as much as we should? Probably not, but you know, I mean, that's always an option too, is to get some type of sensor to carry. But yeah, no, like Drew said, whether they're agitating or not, I mean, just being around a manure pit, you gotta stay aware. So.
Andrew brings up rent a wearable gas meter. Andrew, I don't exactly know what that is. I know we have our manure gas testing equipment in the office, which we've never used, but I would like to know what a wearable gas meter is. That might be an idea, especially underbarn systems. That to me is very scary territory to go into. Mitch from Sauk County, he asked for solid manure storage, three-sided stack pads in particular. I've been getting quite a few requests to keep concrete from equipment storage. A lot of people do this, Mitch. They want to place a roof over existing storage, attach roof support beams to concrete walls. Probably not cost shareable, but is this allowable? Would they have to knock a section of the wall to render it unable to store? Mitch, you have to make it unusable for manure storage. So they're going to probably have to knock a hole in the wall to drain it out. As far as attaching a building to your walls, I don't think it's cost shareable unless you know you're going to go through the process of evaluating the walls and then doing a roof over a manure storage. But since you're abandonment, you really don't necessarily have a resource concern anymore. But that being said, I can definitely see why. I know if it was my farm and I had this nice concrete pad with a three-sided box, I would be very tempted to put a roof over that. And you certainly shouldn't dissuade them from doing it, but you don't want to take any liability for that too. So, Travis, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think our involvement would end at the manure has been removed and it's no longer able to store. I think that's where our project ends. So anything the landowner does beyond that that's their business. So
So I hope that kind of gets you guidance. And then Mitch has another question, which I think is a really pertinent question too. The owner wants to start using their idle pit again. Is there a process to evaluate idle pits to determine if they are a resource concern? Would a PE, DATCP, or LCD evaluate idle pits that want to be used again? And I can throw into that where you've got older manure pits that weren't being used that now might be wanted to be used as a CAFO operation, as a satellite manure pit. That was kind of a thing for a little bit. So how do we do that, Travis? I mean, how do we evaluate an idle pit? And you know, when I think idle pit, less than 2 years, is that what you're thinking, Mitch?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, you know, usually it needs to meet the standard. So if it gets too old, the older it gets, the harder that's going to get to do. And I've been involved with some as recently as last year, CAFO ones, looking at satellite pits, and you know, and working with DNR on those. You know, basically they're looking for, you know, you're doing test pits around the outside to verify separation distances. You're actually DNR's requiring Shelby tubes being pushed into the liner and into the side slopes to verify permeability. So it's, I mean, yeah, you have to be able to show that you can meet, you know, some reasonably new standard. I mean, whether it's the newest one, you know, I mean, obviously that's ideal, but I think ordinances are going to come into it as well. I mean, it's going to have to meet, you know, at least I would assume it's going to have to meet ordinance, which is going to have to meet, you know, in most cases, the newest standard. So it's going to be doing the best you can to try to gather the information to be able to say that. So, you know, again, verifying separation distances, you know, trying to figure out, you know, what that liner looks like. You know, that's kind of what you're looking at. So, I mean, it's definitely, I will say it's not that easy. There's a lot of gray in evaluating existing pits, but I know DNR uses the term, you know, uses kind of the phrase that it meets the intent of the standard. So I guess take what you will with that. But the ones I've been involved with, we've been looking at, you know, new test pits, and then looking at the liner without obviously compromising it. You know, that's the other thing you need to be careful of. But
well, one more comment. Seth brings up a comment. 4-gas meters are good, but never go into a tank unless you're trained to enter confined spaces and have the appropriate PPE, monitoring ventilation and retrieval are the bare minimum. You know, that's a standard rule of thumb for conservation. There's a few things, you know, that everybody should not do. Don't drink at work. That's rule number 1. Don't go into a trench over chest feet high. You know, if you walk onto a feedlot and the farmer says the bull has never been a problem, don't go on the feedlot. And 4, don't ever go into a tank, ever. You know, and I'm guessing there's some other hard and fast conservation rules that I'm missing, but those are the first 4 that I can think of.
don't ride in the excavator bucket.
No, that's a yep. Yeah, that'll get you too. Yep. So.
But yeah, don't go into tank. Yeah, there's no reason for us to go into tanks.
You know. So Travis, with that being said, I don't see any other questions and comments, and I do certainly appreciate your feedback and your comments and your experiences. And I encourage you in this next section, when Travis delves deeper into compost than we've ever wanted to go, please bring your comments to the forefront. It'll make for a eventful final remainder of the day. So with that being said, Travis, let's talk about compost and manure pit. Compost and manure.
All right. So yeah, let's mental cleanse. We are moving on from waste facility closure, and now we are getting into the wonderful world of manure composting. So manure composting, again, the question of why do we care about this? Why am I even talking about this? Well, Manure composting has a lot of benefits. One obvious one, soil health. Composting when land applied is good for the soil. It adds a lot of structure, adds a lot of water holding ability. It's good stable nutrients. The other thing is you can get a waste reduction from your manure when you compost, somewhere in the realm of 40% volume reduction, which I don't think there's a landowner out there that wouldn't like to see a volume reduction with their manure. And with that, we're talking about less storage needs because we have less volume. So less storage is less hauling, which all good things, obviously. The other thing that has really kind of spurred manure composting conversation last couple of years is the NR 151 slurry and bedrock performance standard. Composting manure coupled with incorporation allows you to land apply manure in those depth categories. I think it's the 2 to 3 and 3 to 5 or something. I have to look at the code itself, but composting allows land application in situations where normal manure is not allowed. So that's kind of spurred a lot of interest in manure composting for landowners that are being impacted by shallow bedrock land base. And the reason composting is acceptable is when composting is done right, you do get a reduction in pathogen risk with the manure, and also you're going to get weed seed reduction and things like that. Odor reduction. Composting doesn't stink because it's aerobic digestion as opposed to anaerobic, like a digester. So you're not going to get a lot of smell from it. And again, the economic standpoint, going to pertain to a lot of those areas that I just talked about. So a lot of benefits of manure composting if you do it. All right, so before we get too far into this, we need to get a brief crash course in composting and what is composting. So basically, simply, it's controlled aerobic decomposition of organic matter, which in this case is manure, by microorganisms. That's simple as it gets. So aerobic is oxygen, as opposed to anaerobic, which is no oxygen, which an example of that would be a manure digester. Again, this is all, we're not doing anything different than what's already occurring out in nature. We're just kind of controlling it and facilitating it. So it's all about the microbes. Composting is all about the microbes. So microbes are obviously a living thing, so they need food, water, and oxygen. And that's kind of what we try to maximize to get them to do their job as efficiently as possible. So what are the key parameters? The first one I'm going to talk about, this is the food. So the nutrient balance, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, this is the food for the microbes. So we're trying to hit kind of that 20 to 1, 40 to 1. A lot of the literature is kind of in that range. The carbon nitrogen ratio has a big effect on composting speed and efficiency. So if your carbon to nitrogen ratio is too high, it can slow down the composting process a little bit, but it's also pertinent to recognize that the carbon to nitrogen ratio drops naturally during composting. So it's better to be on the high end than the low end. If we get on the low end, then we get into things like ammonia and, or bad byproducts that we're not interested in. So think carbon to nitrogen on the higher end. So how does this relate to manure? So raw manure, hot and fresh out of the cow, it is, depending on the cattle type. Freestall manure, we're somewhere around 13:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Again, can you do it at that ratio? Absolutely. But typically, to have the best success, we're looking to mix in something else with the manure. So a lot of times, this is where, bedded pack manure is a good candidate for composting, because, the straw that's in there, the corn stalks, stuff like that, has a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So mixed with the manure, we can get a really, a really good compostable product. So kind of keep that in mind. Again, we're looking to that 20 to 40 is ideal, but it's not that there's a lot of wiggle room there with carbon to nitrogen ratio. The moisture is another big thing. This is the water aspect of what the microorganisms need to survive. Ideal range, we want to be somewhere in that 40 to 65%. Again, think, or think damp but not soggy. That's kind of the in your head is what that 40 to 65% is going to look like. Damp but not soggy. And again, the moisture is going to decrease as we compost. But one thing that's interesting to look at is again, raw manure, hot and fresh out of the cow is, we're well above, typically well above the ideal range for moisture. So we're either going to need to add dry material in. So, again, that's where, kind of that bedding is a nice, a nice addition, or even, I've seen composting sites where, they're mechanically dewatering, with a screw press or something like that to take that raw manure down to a more usable moisture content. So, and again, why does that matter? Well, if it's too wet, it's going to be tough to get enough oxygen into it, because just think if it's soggy, soppy, wet, you're going to have anaerobic conditions. And then, too dry is going to have its own set of problems. It might actually get too hot and could have a fire risk. So moisture is important. Oxygen, again, we want aerobic decomposition. We want to preferentiate those aerobic microorganisms, which means we got to get oxygen into that composting pile. So that's where, having a good fluffy compost with a good moisture content is important. All right. So I think when everybody thinks compost, they think temperature. That's kind of the composting, poster is the steaming pile. So that temperature is a result of the microbial activity. The temperature goes up and it goes down. So we have this, this range of temperatures. So as those microbes within the compost work and do their thing, that temperature is gonna go up, but once those conditions of food and moisture and some of those things start to deplete, that the microbial activity is going to go down and the temperature is going to go down. And that's when, turning compost becomes key. So we can, mix that compost back up, get that fresh food to those microbes and get that spike up again. Now, as far as temperatures and duration, what you need to hit is going to depend on the end use of that compost. If a landowner is looking to sell this stuff, that's going to have different temperature and temperature durations than if they want to land apply it. So that's gets a little more specific to the site and the use. But I think the NRCS standard 317, which we'll talk about, talks about 5 days above 105, which that's probably more the basic end. If a landowner thinks they're going to sell the stuff, they're going to need to do hotter than that, longer than that, just for pathogen safety standpoint. So, all right, so let's talk briefly about the composting process. So those are all kind of the elements we need to compost. So the process, again, the one we think of the most is kind of this period 1. This is where we're getting our vigorous microbial activity. We're getting our high temperatures, our spikes. We can get composting spikes, 130 to 160. I mean, you can get higher than that, but that's where we get into, potential combustion risks if we start getting above 160. So we don't like to see that. But again, you get the spike, and then the conditions will be such that the temperature is going to start going down, and then mix it all back up, get the fresh resources to the microbes. The temperature is going to go back up, and again, they're going to use it up, and eventually we're going to reach a point where we can turn that compost all we want, and the food's just gone. The resources, the microbial activity has done its job, and you're just not gonna, eventually you're not gonna get the same spikes. So that's where we kind of move into the second period of composting. This is, again, not as much what we worry about, but this is kind of the temperature spikes are gone, and more the slower decomposition starts to. All right, so how do we compost? I mean, there's no right way to do this. There's lots of methods. I mean, the most common ones are probably the windrow. I mean, that's, again, kind of if you picture composting, manure composting in your mind, you probably picture a windrow system. You can also do a passive pile type thing. Obviously, we get all the way up. Those are the cheapest ones, simplest options. We can also look at some of the Cadillac type systems, the in vessels, which obviously work awesome, but come with a price tag. You can also, there's also, forced air type composting, where you're forcing that oxygen into that compost to make sure that you got good aeration. But again, less common. Most of the time, for most everyday landowner, the winter stuff. All right, so I wanted to talk briefly about NRCS's composting facility standard. This comes up a lot when we're talking manure composting, and not a lot of people kind of know what the standard is, because hasn't been used a ton in the past. So it's important to understand that 317 is, it's the composting facility. This is the facility. This is the construction of the structure, the device where you compost. So whether it's a pad or, the area around the in vessel or whatever, this is the structure. Not to, this is not, again, this is specific to composting. So this is not solid manure storage. This is a composting structure. I mean, is there a lot of difference between the two? Not really, as we'll see, but just be aware that this is geared towards specifically a compost. So some of the key points out of this standard, there is a section in 313, which is additional criteria for stacking facilities and composting facility falls under the stacking facility criteria in 313. So it's, you know, stacking facility is going to have similar criteria to a composting facility. The separation distances for a composting facility are going to follow 313 table 5, which is the permanent solid stacking criteria. At the animal production area, there is a solid stacking standard for outside the production area, which that's different. So we're looking at the animal production area. So, you know, that's kind of that table. For those of you familiar with 313, you know, there's all those options for roofed, not roofed, surfaced, not surfaced. It's that table. So, but the other thing you can use is just, you know, the 522 standard, which is just the concrete lining standard. You know, you can always do essentially a 313 type floor for a composting facility as well, depending on your site constraints. If you have separation distances that aren't going to work for the table 5, you know, 522 might be a good option as well. A lot of guys like the idea of having a roofed composting area, just because it's easier to manage moisture within the compost if you don't have precipitation, and as well as not dealing with runoff and things like that. So, I mean, roof is an option, and obviously that would meet, you know, the NRCS roof and cover standard. You do need to keep leachate and contaminated runoff in mind when you're doing a composting facility. So, you know, composting facilities are still subject to significant discharge to waters of the state. I'm actually involved with one right now that's a composting facility that has an NOD. So don't think that just because you're composting, you know, there's no environmental risk there. It's still something to keep in mind, that, you know, runoff off of that compost is still going to need to get either, you know, stored or treated in some way. There's obviously all the other conservation strategies for dealing with that, but to keep that in mind. You know, I've run into a lot of landowners that think I'm composting, I don't need to worry about that stuff. So you do. And then the other parts of the standard, it's, you know, kind of it's the classic considerations, plans and specs, operations and maintenance, all that stuff. But it does get into monitoring and documentation of composting. It gets into some composting process type stuff, and then some stuff related to finished compost use. So there's some good, outside of the criteria part of the standard, there is some good composting information in. All right, so there's other stuff to consider. This is more specific to landowners. Obviously, moisture content of the manure is a big one, like we already talked about. You know, your raw manure is probably not going to work for composting. So, you know, either you're going to have to de-water it somehow or mix something in. Thinking about what do you have available for carbon nitrogen ratio supplements. You know, do you have straw? Do you have waste feed? You know, stuff like that to boost up the carbon nitrogen ratio if you need to. And then how much manure are you dealing with is obviously important. And one key thing with manure composting is it does involve monitoring and management. You know, I've gotten the feedback working with composting a lot that, you know, why do you guys make composting so damn hard? But it does require some work, and, you know, manure composting is not as simple as throwing solid manure in a pile out back and forgetting about it for 6 months. You know, it's going to take some management. Now, do you need $100,000 piece of turning equipment? No, you can successfully compost with a skid steer or front end loader. but it's obviously going to take more time, and do those specific turner type pieces of equipment are fantastic, obviously. Or, you know, in vessel is obviously huge financial investment, but you know, maybe that works for that facility. So, and it does, you know, the other thing is just the monitoring and, you know, the temperature probes. I mean, I have a compost temperature probe in my office that DATCP got for me. It was like $100. You know, it's a 4-foot probe, you know, so really that's really, that and a piece of paper is really all a landowner needs to get some type of monitoring going. You know, it's just to have some way to keep an eye on temperature and know when to, you know, when those temperatures are starting to peak and go down, turn. So it's just that I think that's kind of what separates composting from other things is it does require some monitoring and management. And then obviously location, like we talked about, need to be aware of runoff and where that water is going to go, as well as access, landowner access too. Exposure to weather, you know, if it's not roofed, obviously, you know, the concern is moisture from precipitation. You know, might have to do turning more often, or have, you know, some dry material to mix in if that becomes an issue. And obviously we live in Wisconsin, so we have cold climate for part of the year, and that's going to impact, you know, pile size or windrow size, you know, to maybe get some insulation. So just I'm not going to go totally through all this, but you know, the regulations, just be aware that, you know, again, what the landowner does with their compost is going to impact what rules are going to apply. Manure composting is exempt from a lot of the DNR rules if it's done on site, they're utilizing on site material only, and then they're land spreading it following their 590 on their land. You know, once you start accepting off-site material or trying to sell it, you know, then you start getting into some other regulation areas that a landowner would need to be aware of. So I just wanted to bring this up real quick. This was a documentation this is a document that's out there if anybody's interested. Kevin Erb put this together with the collaboration of myself, Travis Ingalls in Kewaunee County, and Joe Johnson, who's retired now, but was with NRCS. So the four of us put this document together. It talks about manure composting. It's geared towards kind of the karst areas of the state, but it really does apply, you know, it gives good statewide information on manure compost. So the goal of this document was to have something you could hand a landowner and start manure composting conversation. So some good basic information. So if anybody wants this, I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but talk to me, we can get it to you, or really any of your engineering contacts should be able to, we can get it to you. So just be aware that this is out there, and it's a pretty nice document, not just because I helped write it, but it actually is pretty good. So. All right, there's a QR code for those that need it, and that's all I got. So
well, no, we got some questions here, Travis.
No,
I know we got some questions. Hop back in the chair.
It's almost 5 o'clock somewhere.
I know it is. I know it is. All right, and these are important questions. So Chase from Dunn County says, I'm assuming most county manure storage ordinances would require a manure storage facility permit for a composting facility. I would concur with that. I think. Anybody else? Any counties out there that don't require that? You know, I know we had some discussion on, under barn bedded pack. I think in Door County back years ago. I don't think that was regulated, but this certainly I think would be. Anybody out there have any comments on that? Oh, hang on, I got more questions.
Hey, Drew, this is John from Dodge County.
Hey, John. Yeah.
Hey, currently our ordinance does not cover this. It does not cover stacking pads. However, you could possibly read into the language where it says 313 and any further updates to it and probably get around it that way. But currently our ordinance does not cover these.
This is Paul from Fond du Lac. I would say it also kind of depends on the facility.
So we're getting a lot of tweeners here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
a good answer.
no, and that's why I think it's a fair question to ask, because each county is going to look at it a little different. And anybody else want to jump in on this? I know it's late in the day, but why not? Okay. Well, Travis,
hello.
Go ahead.
This is Greg in Eau Claire County. I'll just jump in what we did. We updated our manure storage ordinance a couple of years ago to incorporate NR 151. We added something within the ordinance that moving of manure is considered manure storage unless you're hauling it directly out to the field. So therefore, if you're stacking manure or composting it, it falls underneath our ordinance, which requires you to follow manure storage or the stacking guidelines.
That's interesting.
So that's one thing we did within our ordinance to kind of address those things.
Okay.
That's the case. We've got a whole lot more manure storage facilities in our county than what we originally interpreted.
Yeah.
You know,
as do we.
It's wow. Okay.
Well, Chase, I don't think we answered your question, but we certainly gave you and a lot of other people a lot to think about, because those are good comments. And again, this is what a technical roundtable is, to let us know what you're doing. So maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it doesn't work for our county. So I appreciate your comments. Anybody else want to, walk into that minefield? Okay, one more question. This is from Amy in Dane County. What about composting on headlands? We have farms that are interested in formally composting, but they're in their field edges.
My question would be the duration, because yeah, I mean, can you compost that quick enough to meet that? Because you're probably going to be under that temporary, that temporary stacking standard, that 316 or 318 or something. It's like I have not dove into that standard, but you'd have to look at that really close and see how composting would fit into that, because
Yeah, Amy says wintertime.
yeah, so yeah, I guess can they get it composted and get it out of there to still meet that standard? If they can do that, maybe.
So, well, here's another good solid question, which I think will create a lot of people to scratch their heads. Tina from Dunn County asks, how is runoff from piles, composted piles, being assessed if in violation of NR 151 manure management prohibition? I would assume that it would be considered a manure pit or structure, a runoff from a manure pit. I would consider that, because that you're still storing manure.
Yeah, it's still manure, so yeah, it's going to be no different than a stack, or something like that. So
yeah, it's not feedlot runoff.
No.
Okay, I don't see any more comments, and your numbers are dropping, Travis.
All right.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're a little past, so it's.
Well, if I can quick step in and just say a big thank you to Travis and Drew for leading this. Feel free to throw a reaction in there, maybe some applause or some crying faces, depending on how long you've been with us today. I also like to just send a quick thanks to everybody who's been involved, from our keynote speaker, Jay Fear, to all of our speakers, and especially our participants, because without our participants, our conference doesn't exist. So thank you for everybody who's part of that and making that possible. Tomorrow's session begins at 8 a.m. with a session on multi-discharge variance funding. How's it working? With Paul Tallard from Fond du Lac County, Matthew Clardy, and Andrew Craig from Wisconsin DNR, Department of Natural Resources. So thank you for everybody for participating. And once more, if you need those PDH self-reporting information, just do that in the chat for you. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Yep, thanks, everybody.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.